Hello. So, the first little talk on the Psalms for Lent. I've prayed the Psalms for nearly 40 years each day, but I've never ever given a talk on them. I'm certainly not an authority on them, but I've always wanted to read up a little bit more about their background, and with the advent of Compline night prayer and our decision to broadcast that every night in Lent, I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to do some study and to share that study with you, because I think there is a great ignorance about the Psalms. They've been described as the most widely used and best loved prayer book in the world. The 150 Psalms, sometimes in little editions, sometimes in the middle of the Bible, in the wisdom books found in every Bible. And it's prayer book, but also the prayer book of the church, and even the prayers of Mary and Jesus and the early church. Mary's great song of praise, "My soul glorifies the Lord," the Magnificat, that's very much a kind of psalm. Jesus, dying on the cross, in 3 of the 4 Gospels, has a psalm prayer on his lips as he dies. Matthew and Mark, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The opening line of a psalm that actually ends in trust, even if it opens in despair. And Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Another psalm. And in the life of the early church, Peter's great speech on Pentecost Sunday, leading to the baptism of people and the birthday of the church, he quotes the Psalms to explain the resurrection, or an interpretation of the Psalms. So, what are these Psalms? Well, on one level, they're one of the books of the Old Testament, and there are 150 Psalms. A psalm in Hebrew, Philim, which means praises. So 150 prayers of praise. In Greek, psalmoi, which means a song that is accompanied by the lyre and harp. The 150 Psalms are divided into 5 books. They're poetry. They were composed to be sung, and they're also prayers. Just as the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, the law, are ascribed to Moses, so the Psalms are ascribed to King David. But in fact they were composed over a long period of time, and it seems they took their final form in the 2nd or 3rd century before Christ, around the time when they were translated into Greek. They were cited by the early Christians often. Monks and nuns traditionally pray the 150 Psalms, and because you need a certain amount of education to read and learn, the Rosary, in a sense, that came into existence as a kind of alternative for ordinary folk. 150 Hail Marys. If you go with the 3 sets of mysteries, joyful, sorrowful and glorious. That was for ordinary folk without learning to be able to pray, just as the monks prayed the 150 psalms. And today you have pop songs that are based on the psalms. Was it Boney M? Well, not quite today, that was 30, 40 years ago. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept. How can we sing one of Zion's songs? Zion's songs are the psalms. So in exile in Babylon, the Israelites wanted to sing the psalms, but their hearts were too heavy. They're very closely linked with the history and spirituality of the people of Israel. And I'm going to give a quick overview of that, just because often we don't really help people to see those 2,000 years of history before Christ in a kind of chronological order which helps us place things. So just a very brief overview, a little bit of history as always. Abraham, perhaps the first historical figure in the Bible, perhaps about 1850 BC, who makes the journey from Iraq, Ur of the Chaldees, to Canaan. 150 years later, the patriarchs are in Egypt, Joseph having been sold into captivity and then the family having gone there in a time of famine. Fast forward about 450 years, 1250 BC, the Exodus. The Hebrew slaves escape from Egypt and they make a covenant and are given the law, the Torah, at Mount Sinai. And several decades later, they enter into the promised land, into Canaan, about 1200. Then you've got about 180 years of the judges, war leaders, keeping the Israelites safe. And the first king, about 1030 BC, Saul. And then the second key moment, or the third key moment, if you're going to take the first, Abraham, 1800 BC, the second, the escape from Egypt, 1250. About 1000 BC, King David, who is the second king, who unifies the people and who captures Jerusalem and makes it the capital. And there sets up the tent with the Ark of the Covenant. And say 40 years later, Solomon will build the first temple, about 960 BC. And there's always a close link between the temple and the Psalms, because it seems that the Psalms were originally created to be sung in the temple. So 930 BC, the two kingdoms divide, north and south. Judah in the south, Israel in the north, and they're separate ever afterwards. 720 BC, Samaria falls to the Assyrians, who ethnically cleanse them, and then you have a sort of mixed group living there who are viewed as heretics. Hence, in Jesus' time, the Samaritans are not looked upon fondly. And perhaps the fourth key moment, 587, the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, and the temple being destroyed, and what's called the Babylonian captivity, 50 years in exile, again ethnically cleansed. Then Cyrus, king of Persia, Iran, frees them, and you have the Persian period for 250 years, from 530 to, for 200 years, 538 to 333. And then the second temple is built about 520, but on a much less grand scale. And after the Persians come the Greeks. And by this time, there's a longing for a Messiah who will free the Israelites from dominion by these great empires. And by then, Israelites, Jews are scattered all over the Mediterranean. And the Septuagint, the first Greek translation from Hebrew to Greek, takes place in Alexandria, it seems, in Egypt. And that's when the Psalms are finalized. And then the next great empire, Pompey and the Romans in 63 BC. The temple is destroyed again, but it's rebuilt by Herod the Great in a very grand way in 19 BC. So a little kind of overview there. The four key dates perhaps to remember: 1850 Abraham, 1250 the Exodus from Egypt and settling in the Promised Land, 1000 BC David unifying the kingdom, the two kingdoms, or creating a unified kingdom and making Jerusalem the capital, and then 420 years later Jerusalem being destroyed by the Babylonians. And so Psalms are written, it seems, in the latter 800 years. They're not really spontaneous prayers of individuals, though they can be very personal, but they reflect fixed forms transmitted down from generation to generation. And there's very contrasting content. Some are hymns and songs of praise. Some are psalms of enthronement, enthroning Yahweh, a feast that perhaps was linked with the New Year, and linked with the enthronement of kings. There's a link between the kings and the psalms, quite strong, close, not just because of David. And then some psalms are individual and communal complaints. That's the basic material of the Psalter, very personal. One of the great forms of prayer was the lament. Things are awful. How is this happening? And then there's the individual and communal thanksgiving. I'm recording this on a Monday morning after we've just celebrated the Feast of the Chair of Peter. And what turns up as the psalm? But the Lord's my shepherd. Which is really a psalm of thanksgiving. And there are psalms for ritual occasions. Try and look up Psalm 131, a simple prayer of trust, one of the most beautiful of the lot. Let's just read it to you, because it's: O Lord, my heart is not proud, nor are my eyes haughty. I do not busy myself in great matters or in things too wonderful for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child upon its mother's breast. Like a child on its mother's breast is my soul within me. O Israel, trust in the Lord from this time forward and forever. Such a gentle, beautiful psalm. Resting and trusting in the Lord. So many of these psalms are about trusting in God. And then there are what are called the wisdom psalms, a kind of different genre. It talks about the fate of the righteous and the wicked. Perhaps explains why it's placed in the wisdom books in the Bible and the Old Testament. For instance, the first psalm. Happy the one who trusts in the Lord, if I remember correctly. Blessed is the man who has not walked in the counsel of the ungodly, but his delight is the law of the Lord. Now, got to end quite soon because we're coming up to the 15-minute mark. There can come across as moral instructions like that one, but they're more emotive expressions. And perhaps that's one of the glories of the Psalms and why they've been prayed for 3,000 years by all types of people. Their strength lies in their ability to articulate the full range of human emotions, from anguish to joy. Human nature as it is, not as it should be. One of the great Psalms, Psalm 137, you have to cut out two or three of the lines, because it's about dashing the Babylonians' children's brains out. Now, if you're in exile in Babylon, having been ethnically cleansed, you're not likely to be very fond of the Babylonians, but still, well, at least as somebody said, they're honest. To conclude, just as an example of how the Psalms have come to be part of my life, I once made a walking pilgrimage with a group to Rome, from just north of Rome, it might be said, Orvieto, 70 miles. And as we walked, one of our guides suggested that we take a line from the Psalms and just walk with it quietly for 15 minutes. In the morning, let me know your love. Ever since then, when I begin prayer in the morning, I very often just try and slow down and just say, in the morning, let me know your love. And yesterday, or Saturday, preaching for the first Sunday of Lent about how Jesus, reflecting in the desert, came to an understanding of what his vocation was, how he was going to teach and preach and heal, and to have a special care for the poor. And I was very struck that the psalm chosen by the church, Psalm 24, that seems to have influenced his way, or might well have influenced his way of operation. The Lord is good and upright. He shows the path to those who stray. He guides the humble in the right path. He teaches his way to the poor. Jesus is concerned for those in greatest need, perhaps comes or came from his reflection on the Psalms in his prayer. So, next week we'll continue and we'll focus more on individual psalms, taking some of the psalms of night prayer. But hopefully this has been a little bit of an introduction. And if you're going to be joining us on Zoom after watching this on Monday evening, well, do feel free to ask any questions and we can share together, perhaps about the psalms that speak to us. Thank you.